You know nothing about how cruel life was for servants in the Middle Ages. Behind every stone wall, every tapestry, and every burning hearth stood an invisible army. These were people whose names did not appear in the chronicles, but whose labor and sweat paid for all the grandeur of that era. They were the shadows of their masters, existing only to ensure their comfort. Their lives were not adventures, but a daily struggle for survival. They did not wield swords, but every day they fought against the cold, dirt, and fatigue. They prepared exquisite dishes while remaining hungry themselves. They brought warmth to their masters' chambers while freezing in their own small rooms. This is the cruel and silent truth about the life of a medieval servant. Watch the video to the end to find out the true price of warmth in a cold castle and why the most valuable skill a servant could have was the ability to remain invisible. What if I told you that the fiercest battles for power in a medieval castle took place not in the throne room, but in the kitchens and corridors for servants? The world of servants was not just a crowd of equally subordinate people. It was a complex, rigid hierarchy with its own rules, privileges, and punishments. At the top of this invisible pyramid stood the senior servants, who wielded enormous power over those below them. The entire household was headed by the steward. He was the Lord's right-hand man, responsible for the entire estate, from collecting rent to managing supplies. He held the purse strings, the keys to the storerooms, and the fate of every servant in the castle. A single word from him could elevate or destroy. The steward rarely did physical work. Just below him was the butler. Today we think of him as the chief servant, but in the Middle Ages his sphere of responsibility was narrower but critically important. He was in charge of the wine. The steward controlled the wine cellars, monitored the quality of the drinks, and supervised their serving during feasts. In his own world, the kitchen, the head chef was the undisputed king. He was not just a servant, but a respected master whose art defined the prestige of the Lord. The marshal was in charge of the stables and everything related to horses. Horses were a strategic resource, a symbol of status and military power, so the marshal was a key figure. Under his command were grooms, blacksmiths, and junior assistants. He was responsible for the health and training of the horses, which required deep knowledge and experience. The female servants also had their own hierarchy. At the top was the head housekeeper or housekeeper in the case of a large household. She managed the maids, laundresses, and seamstresses. The lady's personal chambermaid held a special position. She was not just a servant, but also a confidant, keeper of secrets, and assistant in the most delicate matters. At the bottom of the ladder were those whose work was the dirtiest and most thankless. These were the scullery maids who spent their days scrubbing pots in cold water. These were the junior grooms who cleaned the stalls. And of course, the errand boys or pages who were at everyone's beck and call, performing thousands of small tasks. For these lowest servants, life was one of double subordination. They had to obey not only the lord and lady, but also every senior servant. Anyone who was even one step above them could give them orders. This created constant tension and an atmosphere of strict subordination. Advancement up this ladder was slow and difficult, but possible. A dishwasher boy could eventually become an assistant cook and then a cook. A page could rise to become a squire. However, for most, the low rank in which they started remained their life sentence. This internal hierarchy was the basis of all castle life. It ensured the smooth operation of the complex mechanism that was a medieval household. But for those at the bottom, it meant a life full of not only hard work, but also constant submission to dozens of different masters. Which of these roles do you think was the most difficult to survive? Being in the Lord's sight as a butler, or doing the dirtiest work as a dishwasher? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes.
Moments ago from
Are you ready to learn the truth about what time the working day actually began in the Middle Ages? For the vast majority of the castle's inhabitants, the servants, day and night as we understand them simply did not exist. Their lives were divided not by hours but by duties. And while their masters lived according to their whims, their servants lived according to necessity. The working day began long before dawn, when it was still pitch dark outside, and ended well after midnight, when even the last candles in the hall had long since burned out. It was an endless cycle of labor, fatigue, and rare moments of sleep. During such hours, the body barely had time to recover, and the mind lived on one habit: to serve. The first to rise were the junior servants, who were called stokers or fireboys. Their work began while the castle was still asleep. They hurriedly got up from their straw mattresses, covered with coarse cloth, and shivering from the cold, pulled on their worn clothes. In the basements and attics, where there was no heating, the air was icy, and their breath turned to steam. They knew that their masters had to wake up in warm rooms, which meant that the hearths had to be lit long before dawn. Buckets of coal, armfuls of firewood, frozen ashes, all this had to be put in order. First, the fire was lit in the great hall, where the Lord and his family gathered, then in the kitchen, and then in the private quarters. Every hearth and every fireplace had to burn evenly and brightly.
Flickering flames intertwined with prayer.
The kitchen servants began their day after them. The cooks and their assistants began preparing breakfast. Although for most of the lords it was more of a late snack. But for the staff, the kitchen came to life with the first sparks of fire. They had to heat up the massive ovens, grind the flour, knead the dough for the bread that was baked daily, chop the meat, and clean the vegetables. Water was delivered by hand. Servants carried buckets from the well up slippery stone steps, sometimes dozens of times in the morning. Any delay could provoke the cook's anger and consequently punishment. The kitchen was a hive of activity and noise. The scraping of knives, the crackling of wood, the shouting of orders. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the narrow loopholes, the castle came to life. The hustle and bustle began. Maids collected the remains of yesterday's feast. Bones, candle stubs, moldy bread. The floors were swept with bundles of straw mixed with herbs to muffle the smells a little. After cleaning, fresh reeds were scattered around. They absorbed the dirt and replaced the carpets. It was hard, almost endless work. Moisture, soot, and dampness made the castle a difficult place to breathe. But no one complained. The servants knew that every morning began the same way and ended in exhaustion. Meanwhile, personal servants, chambermaids, and valets went to their masters. For them, a different kind of work began. Silent work that required precision. They brought jugs of water for washing, towels, and clean linen. The chambermaid had to style her mistress's hair, put on her jewelry, and adjust the folds of her dress. The valet polished the lord's boots and weapons, fastened his belts, and straightened his collar. A mistake could cost him a reprimand, and sometimes even dismissal, because the appearance of their masters was considered a reflection of their honor. When the sun rose higher, it was midday, a time for hard work. The laundresses went to the nearest river or stream, where they washed piles of laundry in the icy water. They used ash and lye instead of soap, rubbing the fabric against the stones until their hands turned red from the cold. At this time, the grooms cleaned the stables, took the horses out for fresh air, and repaired the harnesses. Seamstresses sat in dark rooms and mended clothes by the light of tiny windows. Their days dragged on endlessly, and they often fell asleep right over their work, dropping their needles. All this took place behind the scenes of castle life, which the lords hardly noticed. By noon, the kitchen was in complete chaos, especially if a feast was coming up. Then dozens of people rushed around the stone room, and the heat was so intense that even the walls were covered in sweat. Poultry was plucked, meat was roasted on spits, dough was kneaded with elbows, and broths and sauces boiled in huge cauldrons. All this required coordination and experience. When evening fell on the castle, the servants reached the peak of tension. The lords gathered in the great hall, where torches burned and the aroma of roasted meat filled the air. The servants had to serve the dishes on time, not make any noise, not look the nobles in the eye, and move with agility. Any delay or spilled wine could provoke the wrath of the master. At the same time, they themselves remained hungry. Sometimes late at night, they would get leftovers from the table. Scraps of bread, bones, dried up pieces of pie. After the feast was over, the work did not stop. The kitchen servants scrubbed the cauldrons with sand and ash to remove the soot, while the maids prepared the master's bedrooms. They lit candles, warmed the beds with braziers, and hung up clothes. The noise in the castle gradually subsided, but life inside it still continued. Even when the Lord was already asleep, someone checked the hearth, someone carried water, someone guarded the gate. And only when the last footsteps faded away in the corridors could the servants allow themselves to fall onto their hard straw beds. The cold penetrated to the bone, but fatigue was stronger. Their eyes closed of their own accord, and a few short hours of sleep became their only rest before the new day. With the first crow of the rooster, everything repeated itself again. No days off, no holidays, no hope for an easy life. How long do you think a modern person could endure such a rhythm where work had no beginning and no end? But what if I told you that the hardest work in the Middle Ages was not related to fatigue, but to the constant struggle for what we take for granted today? In the next chapter, we will reveal the hidden battle for warmth. I will reveal to you one of the main secrets of a medieval castle, and it has nothing to do with secret passages or treasures. This secret is warmth. We imagine castles as majestic structures, but we forget that they were primarily huge, cold stone boxes. Keeping dozens of fires burning was a titanic task, and it fell entirely on the shoulders of the servants. The main and only source of heat was an open hearth. In the early Middle Ages, it was located right in the center of the hall, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the roof. Later, fireplaces appeared near the walls, but their efficiency was extremely low. Almost all the heat escaped through the chimney, and icy drafts swept through the hall. This inefficient heating system began far beyond the castle walls. Special servants, woodcutters, felled trees all year round. The wood then had to be sawn, split, and transported to the castle, often many kilometers away. It was hard physical work that required tremendous endurance. Inside the castle, there was a whole logistics system for delivering firewood. Junior servants and pages carried armfuls of logs up narrow spiral staircases from morning till night. The wood was stored next to the hearths, and the supplies had to be replenished constantly. One large fireplace in the main hall could eat a small stack of wood in a day. The responsibility for maintaining the fire in the Lord's chambers lay with special servants, sometimes called hearth keepers. They had to make sure that the fire did not go out, but also did not burn too strongly. At night, they had to get up several times to throw wood on the fire, ensuring their master a comfortable sleep.
Cold tonight, isn't it?
All the more
At the same time, the heat in the castle was distributed extremely unevenly. You could warm yourself by the fireplace, but a few meters away from it, the temperature was almost the same as outside. The Lord and his family sat by the fire in their fur-lined clothes. The servants, constantly rushing around the hall, were in motion, but were dressed in simple, thin clothes. The servants themselves lived and slept in the coldest rooms of the castle. Their rooms in the attics, towers, or basements were not heated at all. Their only source of warmth was their own breath and the body heat of other servants sleeping nearby. They fell asleep in the same cold they had been fighting all day. Another critically important and unpleasant task was cleaning the chimneys. The hearths were heated with wood, emitting a huge amount of soot. A clogged chimney not only impaired the draft, but could also cause a fire. The most terrible disaster for the castle. This dirty and difficult work was done by special people. They had to climb inside narrow, dark chimneys and scrape soot from the walls. It was work done in complete darkness, in cramped conditions, breathing in acrid dust. After such cleaning, a person would be black from head to toe. This task was one of the most despised but absolutely necessary for the survival of the entire castle. Thus, the warmth and comfort that we associate with a medieval hearth were a luxury available to only a few. You can find more details about survival in the Middle Ages and other videos on our channel. Don't forget to subscribe and watch other videos to learn even more details. What if everything you've seen in movies about lavish medieval feasts is only half the truth? Halls filled with game, wine, and sweets did indeed exist, but 90% of the people in that hall had nothing to do with the feast except to serve it. Food in a medieval castle was the most striking symbol of the gap between lords and servants. For the lord and his family, food was a demonstration of status. Tables were laden with several courses. Wine and ale flowed freely. Meals were deliberately prepared in quantities greater than could be eaten. It was part of the prestige. The servants who served the feast spent hours among this abundance. They carried heavy dishes and poured wine, but remained hungry themselves. They were strictly forbidden to touch their master's food. A servant caught stealing a piece of meat was severely punished. It was a test not only of physical endurance, but also of willpower. What did the servants themselves eat? Their diet was meager and monotonous. The staple food was the so-called pottage. It was a thick porridge or soup made from oats, barley, or peas, boiled in water. Vegetables grown in the garden, cabbage, onions, turnips, could be added to it. The bread on the servants' table was also radically different from that of their masters. The Lord ate lush white bread made from sifted wheat flour. The servants were given dark, heavy, and coarse bread made from rye or a mixture of grains, often with bran added. It was nutritious but tough and often stale. Meat was extremely rare on the servants' table. They were given the so-called umbles, animal offal and entrails, liver, heart, lungs, which the nobility considered second-rate food. These leftovers were used to make pies or added to soup for flavor. Fish, if any, was the cheapest kind, salted herring or dried cod. An interesting detail of medieval etiquette was trencheries. In wealthy homes, food was often served not on plates, but on large pieces of stale bread. After a noble eater had finished his meal, this bread, soaked in sauces and meat juices, was not thrown away. It was collected and given to servants or beggars at the gate. The servants' drinks were also simple. Instead of expensive imported wine, they drank small beer or small ale. This was a very weak ale brewed from malt that had already been used for the master's beer. It was watery but safer than drinking plain water, which was often contaminated. Servants usually ate quickly, right in the kitchen or in the corridors. They had neither the time nor the place for a leisurely meal. The head cook often controlled the distribution of food, making sure that no one took more than their share. Control over food gave him additional control over the rest of the servants. Thus, the life of a servant was one of constant contrast. They were surrounded by the smells of roasted meat and expensive spices, but their own diet was barely enough to survive. It was a daily reminder of their place in the world, of a gap that could never be bridged. Could you survive and work hard on nothing but soup and stale bread? But even meager meals required a place to rest. In the next chapter, we will learn where and how these invisible people actually lived. A medieval castle was not only a military fortress, but also a real living organism, inside which the lives of hundreds of people bustled. It was a small world with its own laws, order, and hierarchy. However, the concept of home in this world had a completely different meaning for those who owned the castle and those who served in it. For the Lord, home meant safety, luxury, and peace. For the servant, it was simply a place to shelter from the wind and rain, but not a place where one could truly relax. The servants had a roof over their heads, but they lived without comfort, without personal space, and most importantly, without a sense of belonging. Their rooms were not so much a place to live as an extension of their workspace, and the line between rest and service was virtually non-existent. Most servants slept where they worked. For junior kitchen assistants, the warmest place was the kitchen itself, and they often simply fell asleep by the hearth, curled up on the floor next to the dying coals. Fatigue took its toll, and they could fall asleep right among the pots and pans until the flames died out completely. The grooms settled in the hayloft in the stable, where the smell of hay mingled with the smell of horses. It was damp there, but the warmth from the animals provided some relief from the cold. This arrangement was not accidental. It was convenient for the owners to have their servants nearby. Any order could be given at any moment, and the person had to respond immediately. In larger castles where there was a strict order, servants were housed in shared bedrooms. These rooms were located in the least comfortable parts of the building, under the roof, where it was cold in winter and stuffy in summer, or in the basements, where there was constant dampness. The rooms were large but cold and empty. The stone walls did not retain heat, and the only source of light was a tiny window with wooden shutters or a candle that gave off thick smoke. The air was stuffy, and mold often appeared on the walls. But there was no one to complain to. Such conditions were considered normal and even acceptable. The furniture in these rooms was very primitive. There were no soft beds or feather beds. Servants slept on rough wooden bunks made of planks or on low beds that creaked with every movement. A bag filled with straw was used as a mattress. This straw was changed very rarely, once a year or even less often. Over time, it became saturated with sweat, became hard and dirty, and insects bred in it. Blankets were sewn from coarse wool, sometimes from old clothes. They were thin, heavy, and provided almost no warmth. On cold nights, the only salvation was to press up against the wall or a neighbor to retain at least a little warmth. There was no question of privacy in such conditions. Dozens of people, men, women, and teenagers, could sleep in one room. The space was shared, and no one thought about privacy. There were no partitions, curtains, or screens. Everyone could see and hear everything that was going on around them. Privacy was not considered a value. People lived not for themselves, but for service. All personal belongings, a rarity in those days, were placed in a tiny chest by the bed. There might be a change of clothes, a comb, sometimes a letter from family, or a small cross, the only reminder of home. Even in these conditions, a strict hierarchy was maintained. Senior servants had certain privileges. The steward, housekeeper, or head cook could have their own small room, often next to the room where they worked. These rooms differed only in that they had a door and a separate lamp. For a servant, it was considered a great honor to have their own space, even if it was only a couple of square feet in size. Personal servants, such as valets and maids, often slept near their masters. They used so-called roll-out beds, low beds on wheels that were pushed under their master's bed during the day. This allowed them to be close by if their master needed anything at night. The contrast between the servants' quarters and their master's rooms was striking. The lord and lady's rooms were spacious and richly decorated. Tapestries hung on the walls, which not only demonstrated wealth, but also protected against drafts. Carpets covered the floors. Beds stood with canopies and soft feather beds, pillows and fur blankets. The fire in the fireplace burned all night, illuminating the golden carvings on the furniture. Seeing this every day, the servants understood how different their world was from that of their masters. After cleaning and serving, they returned to their own quarters, to the cold, cramped space, creaking beds, and dim candlelight. The lack of comfort was exacerbated by constant dampness and lack of ventilation. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of smoke, bodies, and mold. The windows were rarely opened because of the cold drafts. Diseases spread quickly, especially in winter. Colds, coughs, back and joint pain were common. However, the servants had no time for treatment. Illness was perceived as weakness, and the weak could simply be replaced by others. Hygiene also left much to be desired. They bathed rarely, usually once every few weeks, and sometimes even less often. The water was cold, and not everyone could afford such a luxury. For a servant, castle accommodation was not a home in the usual sense. It was a place where he ate, slept, and woke up to work again. He did not have his own corner where he could feel safe, talk to a loved one, or just be alone. All their time and space belonged to their master. Their home could only be the hearth to which they were bound by duty, not love. Their life took place within walls where labor and obedience were the only meaning of existence. Such barracks-like bedrooms were not just a necessity, they served as a means of control. When dozens of people lived in one room, it was easy to keep an eye on them. In the morning, they could all be woken up at once, and in the evening, they could all be put to bed at once. Individuality was not encouraged. Each servant was part of a large mechanism, a cog in a system where personality did not matter. Fatigue, cold, and cramped quarters made these people submissive, and their dependence on their masters complete. Thus, the castle, which from the outside appeared to be a symbol of grandeur and power, often turned into a place of silent obedience and eternal labor on the inside. Here is the main secret of a servant's survival, which was not written down in any charter, but which was more important than all the others. It was the rule of absolute invisibility. The success and safety of a servant depended not only on how well he worked, but also on how inconspicuously he could do it. Violating this rule was tantamount to disaster. From the very beginning, servants were taught to be shadows. they had to move silently around the castle. Loud conversation, laughter, or even the click of heels in the presence of their masters was considered the height of insolence. The ideal servant appeared when needed and disappeared as soon as he was no longer needed. Direct eye contact with a lord or lady was strictly forbidden. A servant had to stand with his eyes downcast and speak only when addressed. Looking a master in the eye was a challenge, a demonstration of equality, which was unthinkable. It was a psychological erasure of personality. The entire life of a servant was subject to the whims of their masters. They had no schedule or plans of their own. If the lady decided in the middle of the night that she wanted warm milk, the servant had to get up immediately, go to the cold kitchen, light the fire, and carry out the order. Refusal or delay were impossible. Servants were living witnesses to their masters' entire lives, their quarrels, intrigues, and private moments. But they had to be not only mute, but also deaf. Discussing the affairs of the masters among themselves was one of the most serious offenses. A servant who knew too much or talked too much was a threat and was immediately dismissed. This need to be invisible created enormous psychological pressure. Servants were constantly on edge, afraid of making the slightest mistake, dropping a tray, spilling wine, entering a room at the wrong time. The price of a mistake was disproportionately high, and praise was extremely rare. In this atmosphere of total control and lack of personal boundaries, the servants had almost no outlet. The rare moments when they could be themselves occurred late at night in the kitchen or in their small rooms, away from the eyes of their superiors and masters. These short hours were the only time when they could exchange news or simply remain silent. The only way to express themselves was through their work. A good cook took pride in his dishes, a skilled seamstress in her embroidery. Although all the glory went to the Lord, this inner sense of craftsmanship was the only form of self-respect available to them. This unspoken code of conduct was more important than any written law. It turned a person into a function, an impersonal mechanism for ensuring comfort. A servant was a living, breathing piece of furniture. He had to be useful when he was needed and completely invisible when he was not. Constant fear was the norm. Fear of the manager, fear of the cook, fear of the master. This system, built on complete submission, was effective, but it required a person to completely renounce their own self. What do you think was harder to bear? The physical exhaustion of endless work, or the constant psychological pressure and the need to be nobody? But this invisible work consisted of very specific and often unpleasant tasks. In the next chapter, we will look at what their day actually consisted of. The life of a servant consisted of endless repetition of the same tasks. The work was dirty, monotonous, and physically exhausting. They had their tools, but they were not swords and spears, but buckets, brushes, and rags. Let's take a closer look at what filled their days. One of the most labor-intensive tasks was laundry. In a medieval castle, a huge amount of dirty laundry was produced: tablecloths, bedding, clothing. This was done by the laundresses. The work was not done in the castle, but at the nearest river in all weathers. The laundry was soaked in large vats with lye, a caustic mixture of ash and water that corroded the hands. Then the laundresses stood for hours in the cold river water, beating the laundry with wooden rollers against stones to remove the dirt. After that, the wet, heavy laundry had to be wrung out and hung up to dry. In winter, this work became a real ordeal. Hands froze to the wet fabric, and the laundry froze on the ropes. Another center of hard labor was the kitchen, or more precisely, the dishwashing area. This was the lowest rung of the kitchen hierarchy. After each feast, there were mountains of greasy dishes, wooden boards, tin plates, huge copper pots. There were no detergents except sand, ash, and boiling water. The dishwashers spent hours scraping the cauldrons, which were covered with a thick layer of burnt grease. Their hands were constantly in hot water or corroded by lye. It was endless, dirty work in a damp and dark room, where there was almost always an unpleasant smell. Cleaning the floors in the castle was also a specific task. The stone floors were cold and uneven. They were rarely washed. Instead, they were sprinkled with fresh straw or fragrant herbs such as lavender or mint. This was done to absorb dirt, food scraps, and spilled liquids, as well as to mask odors. However, the fresh layer was simply poured on top of the old one. Only occasionally, perhaps once every few months, was the old rotting straw raked out. This work was extremely unpleasant, as the lower layers were a caked mass of dirt and waste. Servants carried it out in buckets and covered it with a new layer. One of the most necessary but despised jobs was waste disposal. Castles did not have sewage systems in the modern sense. Chamber pots were used, which stood in the Lord's chambers. In the morning, the servants had to collect these pots, take out their contents, and pour them into a specially designated place, either a ditch or a special cesspool. This job was usually given to the youngest or most disobedient servants. It required not only physical strength to carry heavy vessels up and down stairs, but also the ability to put up with the constant stench. It was another invisible but critically important task for the functioning of the castle. We must not forget the constant need for water. There was no running water in the castle. All the water, for drinking, cooking, washing, and cleaning, had to be carried by hand from the well in the courtyard. From morning till night, the water carriers walked up and down countless steps with their yokes and heavy buckets. All these tasks were performed with primitive tools, brooms made of branches, wooden buckets, and rough rags. The work was entirely manual and required enormous physical effort. Every day, the servants waged this endless war against dirt, cold, and waste, making the castle livable for their masters. In a world where servants had almost nothing of their own, even the clothes they wore did not belong to them. A servant's appearance was not a matter of personal choice, but a reflection of their master's status and wealth. Clothing was a uniform, a sign of belonging, almost like a brand. Most lower-ranking servants wore the simplest, most utilitarian clothing. It was made from the cheapest and coarsest fabrics, unbleached linen or thick wool. The main requirement for such clothing was not beauty, but durability. It had to withstand years of hard work and endless washing. The colors were dull and unremarkable: gray, brown, beige. Bright dyes were expensive and reserved for the nobility. A servant in bright clothing would be perceived as a violator of the social order. His clothing was supposed to emphasize his low status and make him inconspicuous. A servant usually had only one set of clothes which he wore every day. Sometimes he was given a second set to wear while the first was being washed. These clothes were mended and patched until they literally fell apart. New clothes were not given out on demand, but out of necessity, when the old ones became completely unusable. In wealthier and more noble households, the so-called livery appeared. This was a special uniform worn by servants who were in plain sight, those who served in the hall, footmen, and pages. The livery was a sign of the prestige of the house. It was often sewn in the Lord's coat of arms colors. Wearing livery was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it distinguished the servant from the general masses and showed his closeness to his master. It was higher quality and sometimes even brighter clothing. On the other hand, it further dehumanized the person, turning him into a living emblem of his master. Footwear was also a luxury. Many servants, especially those who worked in the castle, went barefoot most of the time. This was practical on stone floors. Leather shoes were expensive and were mainly given to those who worked outside, such as stable hands or messengers. These were rough shoes that rarely fit properly. Caring for clothing was another responsibility. Servants had to wash and mend their own clothes in what little free time they had, usually late at night. Cleanliness was important. A dirty servant cast a shadow on the reputation of the house. At the same time, personal servants, such as chambermaids, dealt with luxury on a daily basis. They took care of their mistress's wardrobe, which consisted of silks, velvets, expensive furs, and jewelry. They cleaned these clothes, aired them, and helped dress their mistresses. Knowing that they themselves could never afford even a tiny piece of such fabric, this contrast was constant. A servant's clothing was like a second skin, a constant reminder of his place. It was sturdy enough to withstand hard work and simple enough not to attract attention. It was a symbol of his function, not his personality. For a person born in the Middle Ages, the concept of career choice, or finding oneself, was pure fantasy. For the vast majority of people, their life path was predetermined from birth. And if you were born into a family that served in a castle, it was highly likely that you would face the same fate. Children often began working, or rather serving, from an early age. They were sent to the castle as pages or junior kitchen assistants. This was not considered a bad thing. On the contrary, it was a chance to have a roof over your head and a guaranteed, albeit meager, meal. The alternative was often starvation. Once a person entered the servant system, they remained in it for life. It was not a job in the modern sense, which could be changed. It was a condition, a status. A servant was completely dependent on his lord. He could not simply leave and look for another place. Leaving without permission was considered running away and could be punished. Social mobility was virtually non-existent. A servant could not become a knight or a landowner. The greatest career achievement one could hope for was to move up the ladder within the hierarchy of servants. A diligent kitchen boy could become a head chef in 20 years. A capable groom could become a marshal. For a female servant, the pinnacle of her career was to become the head housekeeper or personal chambermaid to her mistress. This gave her a certain amount of power over other servants in more comfortable conditions, but it did not change the essence of her position. She still remained the property of her master. Marriage was also rarely a matter of personal choice. Servants often married other servants from the same house. However, this required the Lord's permission. He could forbid the marriage if he thought it would interfere with work, or, conversely, marry two servants at his discretion. The servants' families lived right there in the castle. Their children were integrated into the same system from birth, helping their parents as soon as they could walk. This created entire dynasties of servants who served the same family of masters from generation to generation. Servants had no personal time. The concept of a day off did not exist. The only respite was during major religious holidays, such as Christmas or Easter. On these days, the work might not be as intense, and the Lord might arrange a feast for all the servants as a sign of his generosity. What happened to a servant when he became too old or infirm to work? There was no single system. In the best-case scenario, if a servant had served faithfully all his life, he might be allowed to stay in the castle, doing some light work. In the worst case, he was simply thrown out of the gates where poverty awaited him. This life was completely devoid of choice. From birth to death, a servant followed a narrow path laid out for him by the social order. His fate depended not on his talents or desires, but solely on the will of his master. When we look at the majestic medieval castles today, we admire their architecture, the power of their walls, and the romance of a bygone era. But these stones are silent about what really sustained all this splendor. All the splendor of knightly culture, all the feasts, tournaments, and courtly love would have been impossible without one resource: the boundless labor of invisible people. The life of a medieval servant was cruel not because of overt violence, but because of its monotony, ruthlessness, and complete lack of prospects. It was the cruelty of a system that viewed people not as individuals, but as functions, as living tools. Their labor was as much a raw material as firewood for the hearth or stone for the walls. We talked about the cold they lived in while bringing warmth to their masters, about the hunger they experienced while preparing lavish feasts, about the endless fatigue from work that began before dawn and ended after midnight, about the humiliating necessity of being invisible and silent. This army of servants was the mechanism that set the whole life of the castle in motion. They were the blood that flowed through the veins of this stone giant. Without the laundress in the icy river, the Lord would not have been able to wear clean linen. Without the cook at the spit, there would have been no roast on the table. Without the groom, the knight would not have gone to the tournament. Their survival depended on complete adaptation. They had to be as hardy as workhorses and as inconspicuous as shadows. They had to suppress their pride, personal desires, and even their sense of dignity. The reward for this was simple. They were allowed to live and continue to serve. The Middle Ages were built on this unwritten contract. Some got everything: comfort, power, glory, and history. Others got nothing but the work that made this greatness possible. They were the foundation, hidden deep underground, on which the entire edifice of aristocratic society stood. Their names and faces have been erased by time. No portraits or memoirs remain. The only monument they have are the castles themselves, which could not have stood for a single day without their daily, selfless, and completely thankless labor. We have lifted the veil on the silent world of medieval servants. Their lives, full of deprivation and hard labor, were the invisible force that kept the fires burning in the hearths and the halls shining. It was a harsh reality, far removed from the romantic novels of chivalry. Which aspect of medieval servants' lives did you find most difficult? Physical labor, psychological pressure, or the complete lack of choice? We would like to hear your opinion. What other hidden or little-known pages of history would you like us to cover in our next issues? Leave your ideas and suggestions in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.